Nothing would prepare him for what would occur on this day. The date was December 20th, 1943. This West Virginia farm boy, whose name was Charlie Brown, not the comic strip by Schultz, but he was a West Virginia farm boy. He never knew his entire future, and those of his crew would lay in the hands of just one man. On this day, Second Lieutenant Charlie Brown, who would be piloting his B-17, what they called the Flying Fortress, the Seattle Times, first time they saw this ship with its 12 50-millimeter machine guns pointed out at every direction on this flying fortress. They called it a flying fortress, a 15-ton flying fortress, and so they coined the phrase flying fortress. Charlie Brown was a very young man in his 20s, early 20s, and he was piloting this ship with these 50-millimeter machine guns and its ability to drop 20,000 pounds of bombs. If you look in history, you know that over the 1.5 million tons of bombs that were dropped on the Germans during World War II, about 640,000 tons of it were dropped by the B-17 bombers. On this day, they would depart the RAF Kimbolton airfield in England on their bombing run that would take them over northern France into Germany, and they were after a city called Bremen. The city had a Focke-Wulf 190 aircraft production facility that the Americans were trying to take out, and they realized in these bombing runs that if they took out some of these production facilities, oil refineries and factories, that they could somehow stop the German war machine from going any farther. The English had for many months had these nighttime bombing raids, and of course they were indiscriminate. They would drop flares on these cities, like places like Dresden and Hamburg, and they would just bomb it at night, and even with incendiary bombs. On one occasion in Hamburg, for example, because of the timber and the buildings that were built at that time and the age of some of those cities caught fire, the flames shot up over 1,000 feet in the air as it burned, creating a vortex that had over 120-mile-an-hour winds that sucked buildings and equipment and human beings into these great fires over both of these cities. Almost 25,000 people died in those nighttime bombing raids. The Americans, however, had elected to go after the precision daytime bombing, which was at great cost to some of the pilots in the air war over Germany during those days. These cities were also protected by flak guns, and you've probably seen some of the old war pictures where these black clouds would ignite close to these bombers as they were flying over. Flak guns were a very precision instrument that was used by the Germans during World War II. And if you think about that technology during that time of 1943, here is a B-17 bomber flying, and usually they would fly at 27,500 feet on their bombing run. They're flying at 250 miles an hour. And you can just think that's 5 miles high. These flak guns were on the ground, and they would shoot these timed charges. And of course, those charges were only traveling at 1,000 feet per second. So at 27,000 feet, that charge took 27 seconds to reach altitude. If you fired the gun directly at the plane when you saw it, and by the time that round made it up to 27,000 feet, that plane would be 2 miles down course. So the Germans had to use their radar ability to not only detect the altitude, but also airspeed of these B-17 bomber groups, calculate their guns, fire their weapons, so that almost 30 seconds later, these bombs would blow up at altitude within 30 to 50 feet of these B-17s. And believe it or not, even with that technology of that day, the Germans had become very adept at taking out some of these bombers during those bombing raids, which would sometimes have 250 to 300 bombers in one bombing run, which happened on several occasions. Ye Old Pub, as the crew named their aircraft, as a lot of these airmen would do, was one of the 12,700 B-17 bombers that were built. Believe it or not, 25 to 50% of these bombers never made it back home. A lot of them were shot down, and if you go today and look for a B-17, you would find out that only 10 remain that are airworthy. Judy bought me a ticket one time on a B-17 that came through Tyler here. I've told you about it. It's called the Aluminum Overcast. It was not one of the olive drab B-17s that you might see in some of these old war films. This one was built later on. It never saw war or never saw military action. It was built late in the war, and it was built out of aluminum. It was shiny, like more of a modern aircraft that you might see, instead of that olive drab color. And of course, I took that flight on that, what I call a tin can with its angle iron riveted inside, not like a aircraft that you would fly in today that has air, it has the ability to have soundproofing and insulation on the inside, and it's a pressurized cabin where you can fly and you can sit there in shorts and a tank top and not be aware of the outside atmosphere or temperature. But this old thing was a tin can. Actually, one of the guys who was on that flight with me, or the one before me, there were 2 flights that day. They took us up about 10 or 12 at a time. The guy that was in the flight before me actually bumped his head and came off bleeding because of all the jagged edges on the inside of this old bomber. As I said, almost half of them or more were shot down during the war. There was an occasion when they bombed the Schweinfurt, the city of Schweinfurt, and another occasion where it was Regensburg, both on the same day, with 250 bombers that would try to bomb these cities in south central Germany, and they were trying to bomb some of these ball bearing factories and also some of the oil refineries. And on one day, it was 36 B-17s were shot down on one city, and the other one had 24, so 60 B-17s, it was called Black Thursday, went down. All of them had 10 boys on board. I call them boys because most of these young men, like Charlie Brown, were in their early 20s. Charlie actually had to lie to his crew because he was the youngest one on board, and he wanted to appear with some sort of authority and experience to the other men on board. They were all older than him, and they were all in their early 20s. That night, 600 cots lay empty in Britain because of the bombing, the 300 aircraft that had shot down those B-17s. These 10 men would take off this morning in the early morning hours of December the 20th, 1943, and almost immediately they began having trouble out of one of the Wright 1,250 horsepower engines. If you've seen pictures of that engine, they counted them 1, 2, 3, 4 prop engines that were big 1,250 horsepower rotary engines. They immediately began having trouble out of engine number 4. And so they brought the RPM down on that one engine, and they knew that they could go ahead and make the trip with the bombing run with 3 of those engines. It was about a 6 or 8 hour flight over the English Channel into northern Germany, where they were going to bomb Bremen. And they were flying at 27,500 feet. Now remember, this is December. Do you know what the outside temperature was? It was 76 below zero. And they're in a tin can. And they have what they call the waist gunners. And if you've been on or seen those planes, these are big giant window openings in the side of the plane where they had 2 guns out on each side of the plane. They flew along and made their way through the bombing run, and because of this flak that they had to make, in 3 minutes out from the bombing run, they had to make altitude and directional changes every 30 seconds. And they would proceed for 10 seconds, and then they would make another change so they could outmaneuver these precision flak guns. They hit the flak, and it immediately blew out that familiar plexiglass nose on the B-17. If you've seen pictures of those, you know that. And when I was flying in that one, you actually go in the radio compartment, and as you walk towards the captain's area, the pilot's cabin, you have to go down in a tunnel, crawl underneath the cabin of the pilots, then the co-pilot, and you step out into this room where this plexiglass nose is. It is an extraordinary view. You are looking at a panoramic view, unobstructed, like you're on a aircraft when you fly today. You only have the view out the window, and every once in a while when the pilot opens the door, you can kind of catch a glimpse out the front. But when you're in that nose of the B-17, you have this panoramic view of Tyler, which I saw as we flew around over for about 35 to 40 minutes. I imagined flying over Britain or over the German countryside, and that bombardier who sits there and the navigator both with his bomb sight making adjustments has this gorgeous view of a sunshiny day during the middle of war. It must have been an incredible feeling. That nose was blown open. Now you imagine you're flying 150 to 250 miles an hour. Now you have negative 76 degree wind blowing through the cabin. What do you think happened inside? The men wore suits that actually plugged into the electrical system of these B-17s that gave them heat. And of course you see the familiar sights where they wore leather with the sheepskin and these leather hats. Now you know why. Because it was extremely cold. They began to freeze. Their guns began to freeze. And because of the flak also had damaged the number 3 engine, they had to take it down to where it was not at RPM and actually shut it completely off. They went ahead and made their bombing run, and because of the damage to the plane, they began to slow down. And as they slowed down, they watched the rest of their buddies in the formation make their way towards the horizon and disappear out of sight. Charlie Brown and his crew were then attacked over a dozen times by the Me-109s of the German Air Force, and they were shot to pieces. Their rear gunner took a cannon shot. It was almost decapitated him, and their plane was shot to ribbons. They managed to escape by taking a dive out of that instance and to evade, because there was one other bomber that didn't make it out of that fight with those fighters. And Charlie Brown and his crew dove down into the clouds. But because of the damage that they incurred to their electrical system, their hydraulic system, their oxygen was cut off. And so Charlie Brown, the pilot, passed out, and so did his co-pilot. They went into sort of a flat spin. At 27,000 feet, they're falling to the earth, free falling. Because Charlie had tried to fight and get oxygen, he has taken his mask off, and so as they descended down and they came back through 10,000 feet, as I did on an airline one time when we lost oxygen, they immediately dropped down to 10,000 feet because there's oxygen at that level. When they came through 10,000 feet, Charlie Brown regained consciousness. He looked over at his co-pilot who was passed out, and he tried to wake him up because he still had his mask on. He couldn't breathe, so he took his mask off and began shaking him as he was trying to regain control of the plane. As he descended down through 5,000 feet, he began to get the plane to waddle some and to begin to fly once again. And he looked over and he finally got his co-pilot to regain consciousness. He realized that they were in bad situation. They only had 1.5 engines left now after the other one they had one that was RPM up, but it had no throttle controls. The throttle controls were shot off, so it would RPM beyond the limit, so they would have to raise up the RPM and then kill the engine and let it idle back down, and then raise the RPM and then let it idle back down. And so he realized he was probably not going to make it back home. So he asked his engineer to go around and talk to the crew and ask them if they wanted to bail out over Germany. They would become prisoners, but at least they would be in a hospital, they would be cared for. They realized that 2 of the men were injured so bad that they probably wouldn't survive the fall. So all the men elected, Charlie said, I'm going to try to make my way back to England. They all elected to stay with Charlie Brown. And so they fly along with their limited power. They can't gain altitude anymore, so they begin slowly losing altitude. As they make their way down through 2,000 feet, they go over this old German training airport. And there happened to be a man there fueling up his Me-109 whose name was Franz Stigler. He saw the plane at 2,000 feet. He thought it was going to land on the airstrip. But as it flew on by, and he was an ace pilot, and there was this community among German pilots who wanted to win what was called the Iron Cross. And if they shot down, I believe it was like 50 enemy aircraft, they would get this Iron Cross, which brought them a great deal of honor and prestige among their co-pilots. Other pilots in the Army, and of course after the war would be, a prestigious thing for them to own as well. He ordered them to take loose the hoses, and he was down on the ground refueling and rearming his plane. He ordered them to take them loose, and even though he had a 50 caliber round in his radiator, and the mechanic said, you cannot fly, he was after that goal, and he jumped in his plane, and he took off. He caught up with the B-17 very shortly. And as he came up on the scene, he noticed that the tail gun was hanging down. The tail gunner was gone. He'd been killed. He couldn't believe that the plane was still flying. Half of the rudder was gone. The elevator on the left side was completely shot off the plane. There were holes big enough in the fuselage that a person could crawl through. And as I said, the plane was shot to ribbons. None of the guns were firing at him. And so he eased up alongside the right side of the plane, and he came up, and he noticed that the top turret gunner was pointing his weapon but not firing. He didn't know that the gun wouldn't fire because it was frozen. He looked through the holes in the plane, and he noticed the injured. They couldn't even give morphine, the little morphine vials that they would give these soldiers, because their morphine was frozen. He noticed that they were caring for these wounded. And as he came up alongside, he saw that almost three of the engines were completely unable to fly the plane. And as he made his way up to the pilot's cabin, and as I remember standing there in that pilot's cabin, you have an absolute perfect view of all 4 engines from that pilot's seat. He looked inside, and he saw the co-pilot and a pilot, and he began motioning them for land in Germany. And Charlie Brown refused. Charlie Brown looked at him and he couldn't believe. He thought he was still hysterical from passing out and becoming and reviving. He thought he was dreaming. But he kept insisting that they would land, and Charlie Brown refused to even look at him. He just kept flying straight ahead, losing altitude. Again, he told him to land, and he wouldn't do it. So he made his way up and over the top of the plane and came down to the left side where he's looking eyeball to eyeball with Charlie Brown. Franz Stigler told him again to land, and he refused to land. And then he began to mouth the words. He was close enough where they could read each other's lips. And he told him to go to, I believe it was Holland, which was neutral territory. And Charlie Brown refused to go. He was determined to make his way back to England. And as they came to the northern coast, or the western shores of Europe, where was the strongest flak batteries on the western shores that protected Germany, here these flak gunneries, these gunnery stations with all of their flak guns, saw approaching from the east a B-17 bomber with a Me-109 on its wing. Now, the Germans had captured some of these B-17s in the past and used them for training. And as they flew at low altitude over this artillery station, not one shot was fired. They flew right over at lower than 2,000 feet, and they made their way out into the English Channel. As they got out over the waters, Franz Stiegler realized that he committed probably what would be high treason against his country. And he realized if they ever found out what had happened, he would probably be shot. As he came alongside again for the last time, he pointed again to Holland, and Charlie Brown refused to go. And so he gave him a salute, and he banked, and he made his way back to Germany. Charlie Brown began descending, and as he was there, he'd ask his men if they wanted to bail out over Germany, and of course they all refused. Now was over the icy English Channel, the North Sea. Then they got to the shores of England. They were at 250 feet, and they made their landing in England. Charlie Brown reported this incident to his superior officers, and they refused to publish it because they didn't want sentiments for the pilots, the German pilots. Franz Stiegler went back to Germany, and he never told any of his superiors what had happened. It was an astonishing moment in this war. Charlie Brown had given his men the option to bail out, and this B-17 barely made its way back to England. Now we fast forward 43 years. The war was over with for both of these men, pretty much, and the war ended not too long after that. 43 years later, in 1986, Charlie Brown was in Seattle, and he was at a combat pilots reunion. They're all sitting around having a drink, and one of the guys asked him if something interesting ever happened to him while he was flying. He'd never actually told anybody of this incident. And so he told the guys at that table, and some of them kind of shook it off. But Charlie Brown decided, you know what? I need to find that man that saved my life that day. And so for 4 years he began writing letters and trying to investigate and find out who that man was, that pilot that saved his life. It wasn't until 4 years later that he found this combat pilot's newsletter, and he actually sent a letter and asked them to publish the letter requesting information, and they refused to do it. But he was persistent, and he knew some people in government and was able to convince them eventually to go ahead and publish his letter. Charlie Brown was living in Florida at this time. He's now up in his 70s. And one day a letter came, and it said, "My name is Franz Stiegler, and I was the man." Over the course of the next couple of months, they were able to talk on the phone, and Charlie Brown was unsure if this was really the man so when he finally got him on the phone, he asked him questions about why did you do that, and he said, "I could not shoot an unarmed plane," because Franz Stiegler had actually fought in North Africa, and one of his commanding officers said, "If I ever see you shoot at a parachute, I will shoot you myself." See, there was this internal code of honor among combatants even during the war, where you didn't shoot an unarmed man. Unlike what happened in the Russian POW camps, or the way that the Americans were treated in the Japanese POW camps. You know, when the Germans came to the United States as POWs, they were able to walk up and down the city streets here in the United States because we had a way of treating someone who was a prisoner. And of course, Franz Stiegler, when he was eventually shot down, and he made his way for the American lines because he knew he didn't want to fall into the hands of the Soviets. And so on this phone call, he told him it was like shooting at somebody that was parachuting. I just couldn't do it. They eventually met in Seattle at a convention, and they both embraced each other and they hugged each other, and they became fast friends. And there's a book called out The High Ground, or The High Call, I think it is called, that documents this entire story. They went around the country telling their story for several years, and both of the men eventually died in 2008, believe it or not. In Exodus, the 23rd chapter, God tells his people Israel, down in verse 4, he says, "If you meet your enemy's ox or his donkey going astray, you shall surely bring it back to him again. And if you see his donkey of him that it hates you, lying under his burden, and you would forbear to help him, you shall surely help him." I guess this story struck a chord with me. I read that book, and it was very intriguing to me that here that the Americans even in many occasions considered, as long as you can consider that enemy as a non-human, like Hitler convinced Germany against the Jewish people, then you don't realize that there is even honor and consideration, I guess, between combatants at times. In Job, the 31st chapter, Job is being accused here of, his behavior, and that's why God brought all these evil things upon him. He makes a statement here in Job 31, and he's defending his position. And look at Job 31, down in verse 29. He said, "If I rejoiced at the destruction of him that hates me, or lifted up myself when evil found him, neither have I suffered my mouth to sin by wishing a curse to his soul." And look down at verse 32. "The stranger did not lodge in the street, but I opened my doors to the traveler." He's talking about people that were his enemy. And he said, I'm not guilty of ever, kicking my enemy when he was down. Proverbs 24, I'd like to read a couple here in the book of Proverbs, where Solomon wrote, and he talks about this different mindset about your enemy. Look at Proverbs 24. Down in verse 17, he says, "Rejoice not when your enemy falls, and let not your heart be glad when he stumbles." In the next verse, he said, "Lest the Lord see it, and it displease him, and he turn away his wrath from him." So it's almost as if God is bringing wrath on your enemy, but if he sees you rejoice over it, then he withdraws his wrath from that person. It's something that God doesn't like to see, I suppose. Look over the next chapter, chapter 25, down in verse 21. "If your enemy be hungry, give him bread to eat. And if he be thirsty, give him water to drink. For you shall heap coals of fire upon his head, and the Lord shall reward you." It's often been said, what is the reason for those coals of fire? Is that really to bring revenge on your enemy? Or is it to lead him, perhaps, by your actions, even though he knows he's your enemy, it leads him to a place of reconciliation? In Matthew, the 5th chapter, Jesus talked about this subject somewhat. Matthew 5, where he gave this beautiful Sermon on the Mount here, where he goes through all of the things that were contrary to human nature, I would say. And the people were astonished at his doctrine, the things that came out of his mouth. In Matthew, the 5th chapter, down in verse 43, he says, "You have heard it said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy." Well, that's common knowledge, right? And it was in Jesus' day. "But I say unto you, love your enemies. Bless them that curse you. Do good to them that hate you, and pray for them that despitefully use you and persecute you, that you may be the children of your Father." It's almost like this is a qualification or a characteristic that you are God's children, which is in heaven. For he makes the sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends the rain on the just and the unjust. For if you love them which love you, what reward have you? Do not even the publicans the same? Oh, they love their kinsfolk and their close associates. And if you salute your brethren only, what do you more than others? Do not even the publicans do so? Oh, they like to shake each other's hands and talk great to one another and lift each other up. But be you therefore perfect, even as your Father which is in heaven is perfect. Doing good to your enemy by conveying God's love, in order that you might win him over to Christ. That's what I wrote in my notes here. That's the Christian duty, to try to win that person over to Christ. That's the goal. In Luke, the 6th chapter, go over to Luke 6, down in verse 27. Luke 6 and 27. This is a parallel here. He said, But I say unto you which hear, love your enemies, do good to them that hate you, bless them that curse you, and pray for them which despitefully use you. And to them that smite you on one cheek, offer also the other. Now that is completely contrary to human nature. In my opinion, if somebody slaps me on the face, your instant reaction is to double up your fist and get after it, as they say. And him that takes away your cloak, forbid him not to take your coat also. Okay, you want my cloak? Here, have my coat as well. Take both of them. Give to every man that asks of you, and to him that takes away your goods, ask them not again. And as you would that men should do to you, do you also to them likewise. For if you love them which love you, what thanks have you, or what credit have you? For sinners also love those that love them. And if you do good to them which do good to you, what credit do you have? For sinners also do even the same. And if you lend to them in hopes of receiving it again, what credit do you have? For sinners also lend to sinners to receive as much again. But love your enemies, do good, and lend, hoping for nothing again. And your reward shall be great, and you shall be the children of the highest, for he is kind unto the unthankful and the evil. Be you therefore merciful, as your Father also is merciful. In Luke, the 10th chapter, as I said, it reminds me of some of the way the prisoners of war were treated by some of the other combatants in World War II, and the way, in comparison to the way the United States treated their prisoners. In Luke, the 10th chapter, there's this example here that Jesus gave to this man. He was a lawyer, and he said, he asked Jesus, what will I do to inherit eternal life? And he said, well, what do you read in the law? And he said, to love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, with all your strength and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus said, you have answered right. This do, and you shall live. And the guy, because he's a lawyer, he had to have an angle. And he says, who is my neighbor? You can almost hear the smarmy attitude in his remark. And Jesus said, a certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among thieves, and he was stripped of his raiment and wounded him, and he departed, leaving him half dead. They beat the guy half to death, took everything that he had. And by chance there came a certain priest that way, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. He didn't even give the guy a time of day. He just headed to the other sidewalk, went down that side of the street, and he went his way. And likewise the Levite, when he was at the place, came by and he looked at him. Well, he at least acknowledged the guy was beat up and bleeding, and passed by on the other side. And he decided, no, I don't think I'll waste my time with this guy. I'm going to head over and go my way. But a certain Samaritan, as he journeyed, came where he was. Now the Samaritans, you remember when Judah was taken away captive by the Babylonians, they had transplanted these other nations into that area of Jerusalem, and they were called Samaritans. And they were like the offscouring to the Jews. They were considered a lower form, a lower class of people. They were the Samaritans. He came where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion on him. And he went to him, and he bound up his wounds, pouring in oil and wine, and set him on his own beast, and he brought him to an inn and took care of him. And on the morrow when he departed, he took 2 pence and gave it to the host and said, "Take care of him. Whatever you spend more, when I come again, I'll pay you what I owe you. Which now of these 3 thinkest thou was neighbor to him that fell among the thieves?" Be rational here. Just use common sense. The guy said, "Him that showed mercy." Jesus said, "Go and do likewise." Jesus had a way of cutting down through all of the layers, didn't he? And getting right to the heart of the matter. Right down to the intentions of human beings. And he had a way of answering people that was very truthful and very sincere. The guy had a choice, I guess, from then on how he would treat other people. You know, in the book of Romans, I'd like to turn there. It says that we were once enemies of God. Romans 5 in verse 7. Romans 5 in verse 7. We'll begin there. It says, now let's pick it up. He says in verse 6, "For when we were yet without strength, in due time Christ died for the ungodly." He gave his life. He shed his own blood. "For scarcely for a righteous man will one die, yet peradventure a good man, some would even dare to die." And I've heard stories, I've read you stories of where a guy jumps on a grenade with his helmet to save his buddies, jumps in front of a machine gun to save his buddies in war, jumps in front of a car. I've seen instances where people dove out into traffic to push someone out of the way, and then they got hit by a car. Or a woman who was car plunged into a lake and held up the baby, and she drowned and the baby lived. Yeah, there are times when a good man would dare to die for someone else. But God commended his love toward us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Much more than being now justified by his blood, we shall be saved from wrath through him. For if when we were enemies, we were reconciled to God by the death of his Son, much more being reconciled, we shall be saved by his life. That is an awesome thought. That even while we were enemies of God, he had this loving mercy and kindness towards us, that he was willing to give his Son for us. And I guess God has this love even for his enemies, and he expects no less of us to have this love for our enemies, that kind of love, to have the foresight and the ability to see in the future possibly reconciliation. In Romans the 12th chapter, down in verse 14, Romans 12 and verse 14, he says, "Bless them that persecute you, bless and curse not. Rejoice with them that do rejoice, and weep with them that weep. Be of the same mind one to another. Mind not high things, but condescend to men of low estate." Jesus was certainly that way, wasn't he? "Be not wise in your own conceits. Recompense to no man evil for evil. Provide things honest in the sight of all men. And if it be possible, as much as lieth in you, live peaceably with all men. Dearly beloved, avenge not yourself, but rather give place unto wrath, for it is written, Vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. Therefore, if your enemy be hungry, feed him, and if he thirst, give him drink, for in so doing you shall heap coals of fire on his head. And here the Apostle Paul is quoting that very scripture that we read. Be not overcome of evil, but overcome evil with good. You know, as Jesus hung there that night on the stake, and his life's blood was beginning to drain out of him, and he began to see his eyes blurred vision, and he knew that the lights were soon going to go out. He looked down and he said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And on another occasion, Stephen, when he was standing there and the stones were being hurled at him, and he knew that he also was about to die, he said, Lord, lay not this sin to their charge. There were many acts of heroism in World War II. I could regale you with stories that I've read, and it happens to be an interest of mine to read that history. But on both sides of the battle, there were acts of valor and valiantry and courage, and above all, honor. This is only one small story in a monumental war, and one story that was almost lost because neither man was really willing to tell the story. But it strikes me as an example of the kind of compassion and forgiveness a man can have for those who are his enemies. Franz Stigler had seen enough war, and he was ready for that one to end. It is a kind of act that deserves recognition, and one that saved the life of not only Charlie Brown, but his crew. When they were reunited years later, Charlie Brown was standing out on the tarmac, and he had invited all of his buddies that were surviving to this air show. And him and Franz Stigler were standing there talking, and they opened the doors of the hangar, and out came all of these children and grandchildren. And one of them walked up to Franz Stigler and threw his arms around him and hugged him, and he began weeping, and he said, because of you, all of these exist. And there were 35 people there that were children and grandchildren of those people that had survived as a result of him not shooting them down that day. As I said, it is a beautiful story, and it is a kind of compassion we all are to have as well. To love our enemies is certainly a Christian characteristic, wouldn't you say?